Hey guys, Chris of the Polish Geek, and welcome to another video game review, Myth Wukong, because I finally was able to play this game because I finally got a PS5, so I finally was able to play the game because this game won a Game of the Award review and it was getting so many positive reviews and everyone was raving on about that that when I got my PS5 it was obviously one of the very first games I wanted to get my hands on and see what the fuss is about. And does the game really deserve all the love it is getting? Did it deserve a Game of the Year award? Well, I say, for the most part, yes, it's a great game and I really had a great time playing it. I mean, obviously I did, otherwise I wouldn't be reviewing this game. Like, if I review a game, chances are I'm really loving it, or at least enjoying it enough to give it a video game review, because if I don't like the game, not only I'm not gonna review it, I will likely quickly put it down and won't even continue playing it. So yes, the fact that I'm reviewing this game shows clearly I very much enjoyed it. It's certainly not a masterpiece, not by any means, and I think that this term is often overused anyway. Like if I compare it to my Game of the Year from last year, Lies of P, although Lies of P is my Game of the Year, it didn't actually win a Game of the Year award. I don't even think it was nominated, but that's neither here nor there. But if I compare Myth Wukong to Game of the Year of 2023, which I awarded to, as I said, Lies of P, I say Lies of P is a much better game, because Lies of P, I would go as far as to say a masterpiece, but certainly not Myth Wukong. But it does change the fact that I had a really great time with the game overall. I really enjoyed it, and I do think it did deserve, ultimately, to win an award. Don't know if I would necessarily award it with the Game of the Year award, but it did deserve it. Let's just say that. The game is kind of a Souls-like game. I mean, it's certainly not Souls-like in the same way as Lies of P, because with Lies of P, as I was playing the game, I almost constantly forgot I wasn't playing a From Software game. I mean, the game was filled with From Software magic through and through, and it actually became one of my favorite Souls-like games together with Elden Ring, actually. But the same cannot be said for Myth Wukong. It's a great game, it's an awesome game, but I don't think it has that From Software magic that Lies of P, on the other hand, very much did have. And this isn't to say that the game doesn't have any magic of it at all. It certainly has a lot of its own charm and magic, though instead of treating it as a Souls-like, I think it's better to just review it as its own challenging hack and slash that certainly was inspired by Souls-like. It certainly shares a lot of mechanics with Souls-like games, such as being really challenging, although not as challenging as most of them, enemies respawning, checkpoints like bonfires and statues of Buddha, but in the case of Myth Wukong, it's the altars. And yep, that's what the game is for me, a hack and slash inspired by Souls-like. During this review, I will very much compare it to Souls-like if necessary, but as I said, this game differs from a lot of them in many ways. First and foremost, as I said, while it is pretty challenging, it's nowhere near as much. Compared to From Software games, the game is actually quite easy. Plus, there is no penalty for losing to the boss or the regular enemy for that matter. You just respawn at the last altar you discovered. But you do maintain all your souls upon the last two, or in this game's equivalent of souls, which are called sparks. One of the most interesting aspects of the game is the player character himself. He's a monkey, which I think is really cool and creative, and somehow it so well fits with the lore and mythology of China. He's called the Chosen One, and the story itself is pretty simple and generic, but the lore though is excellent. Chosen One, the monkey, wakes up some morning and decides to look for 6 relics of Wukong. And maybe while the general narrative is pretty generic, the lore on the other hand is a whole different matter. I also really love the setting and lore of this game and the mythology. The setting that this game uses is something that is rarely seen in either Western video games or Japanese video games for that matter. It uses Chinese setting, lore, and mythology, and natural since this is actually a Chinese-made game, and it is actually pretty low budget, but for a low budget game that Black Myth Wukong is, it manages to include a lot of things. It's clear that the creators tried to include as much as possible and do with the limited budget they had to do their best. The story of the game is generic, it's not particularly groundbreaking, but then again, in most Souls-like games actually, there is very little story in the first place. I do know that the story is technically based on Chinese book Journey to the West, but I'm not really familiar with Journey to the West, so I can't speak on that. But I do really love how anytime you start a chapter, you for example get a backstory about the main villain of every chapter who generally is the final boss. I really love that, and what I also even love more is how each of those stories uses a different animation style. Like one uses a clay animation, the other one uses a hand-drawn animation. This is really unique and creative. It's obvious how much the writers were very much thinking outside the box and getting creative. And almost every single character, whether an NPC or a boss, has a really interesting and fascinating backstory, which again is told either through an item description or there is an interesting addition of after defeating a new enemy or a boss, you get a journal entry about them and can read the backstory or general description. And we'll get to that soon enough, but another unique thing that this game does is there are a lot, and I mean a lot more cutscenes than you generally expect in Souls-like games. And again, this isn't really a Souls-like game, it's more like a hack and slash that just is inspired by Souls-like in my opinion. But yes, there are plenty of cutscenes that very much move the story forward. As I said, overall lore and backstory of each character is generally pretty excellent and fascinating. While we are on the subject of lore and the story of the game, that actually also brings us to another huge difference between classic Souls-like games and Black Myth Wukong. Black Myth Wukong has a very clear story and narrative, just as Lies of P and Sekiro Shadows Die Twice did, but it is also filled with cutscenes. And while other Souls-like games also certainly had cutscenes, like Sekiro and Lies of P certainly did, but it certainly was not on the same level as Black Myth Wukong, because Black Myth Wukong has plenty of cutscenes that move the story forward instead of just item descriptions and limited NPC talks. I mean, as I said, there still very much are item descriptions and all that, but there also are very much cutscenes that clearly show what happens in the story, even if our protagonist is very much a silent protagonist and never says a word. I think Synthetic Man has done a pretty good review about this game, and he made some pretty excellent points about it. I don't agree with all his points, especially one about the story and lore, but Synthetic Man in general liked the game far less than I did, and certainly was slightly more harsh on it, but in general, that guy has much higher standards than I do, and it's okay. I mean, I know this guy gets a lot of hate, but I think he actually often brings pretty valid points about video games. I might not always agree with him, but his points often tend to actually be valid, and the time period of mainstream game journalists who don't really care about true quality gaming, I think controversial people like him might actually be pretty beneficial and necessary. I personally don't generally review bad video games. If I review a video game, chances are I really enjoyed it, because I'm not really a gaming journalist or video game critic. I'm just this passionate guy who loves to play video games, and he loves what he loves, and will certainly talk of those I feel passionate about and end up really loving. If I dislike a game, chances are I put it down pretty quickly, almost immediately. The combat in Black Myth Wukong is great and a lot of fun. it's kinda challenging when you fight some of the bosses, but outside some of the bosses, I can't really say it's particularly challenging. It's a lot of fun though, as I already said. Your major weapon of attack is a staff which serves as your melee weapon. Spells are also involved in combat, and learning new fun spells is also really cool, although I actually prefer to use the staff because I'm the type of guy that really loves to fight melee in video games. There is, for example, a spell that immobilizes enemies. It's very temporary, but it's fun and can be helpful in a lot of boss battles, but also makes a lot of things much easier. But use it wisely though, because once you do use it, it takes time for it to be possible for it to be cast again. And you also cannot use all of your mana, or else you can't really use the spell again during the fight. And there are also other special moves, such as turning into a ghost very briefly and hitting harder, or creating various small copies of yourself. All those additional movesets make the game much easier from a traditional Souls-like, and there is also an ability that can help you turn into a boss you've fought before. And also, there is a skill tree where you upgrade and learn new abilities, kind of RPG style. The level design in this game, if I'm being honest, is passable. It's not particularly great, but it's not terrible either. So yes, that's why I say it's passable. They're very linear, but sometimes that is all you need. I mean, there are several branching paths next to each other to some altars, and some can lead you to optional bosses or to an NPC that will give you an optional side quest, but at the same time I do feel it's a little bit chaotic with all that. That said, I do actually love the overall look though. This is a really beautiful looking game. Like every single environment on the other hand is brimming with attention to detail, such as Chosen One moving through the snow and seeing the footsteps, or through the desert and also seeing the footsteps on the desert, as well as through a forest at nighttime or caves. Yep, the art is pretty great, and every single area is beautiful, filled with detail, and they are all so different and varied from one another. So, while the level design itself is not great, but the actual look and environments of the levels are pretty beautiful. The enemies in this game are pretty cool and varied overall. They certainly are nowhere near as varied as they are in the From Software games, but still pretty varied overall, and certainly a lot more varied than in most modern video games anyway, and they are generally inspired by Chinese lore and mythology, and I also really love the boss battles in this game, and there are plenty of them. I mean, the quantity of the bosses in this game is so huge that I wouldn't blame anyone for thinking this game is a boss rush, and the variety of bosses is really excellent, as are most of the bosses themselves. I wouldn't be surprised if honestly the developers put their thoughts and budget so much into bosses that as a result, they did overlook making regular enemies more varied and more memorable. Again, I do like regular enemies and I do think they're certainly more varied than in most modern games, as I said. But it certainly does feel like sometimes the developers are mostly thinking of the bosses and some regular enemies became more of an afterthought, really. The bosses also are really the most challenging part of the game, because in Souls-like games in general, both regular enemies and bosses are really challenging and give a hard time. Oftentimes, while fighting regular enemies in From Software games, or other Souls-like games for that matter, you already get really challenged and frustrated, but in Myth Wukong, regular enemies are actually pretty easy most of the time, and it's when you encounter a boss where the challenge truly begins, and even then, only some of the bosses really are challenging. Some of the bosses also are pretty easy, actually. Still, objectively, the game is much, and I mean much easier from Software Souls-like, and most Souls-like in general. If you're a Souls-like veteran and an expert, then this game should really be a cakewalk, really, for you. I've beaten most From Software games and Lies of P, and as a result, I do think that this game isn't really all that difficult. I mean, several of the bosses are certainly challenging, and they gave me a couple of tries, but still, after you beat several From Software games, like me, and also Lies of P, then this game really becomes a breeze.
Dead. Thank you.
Black Myth Wukong is overall a great game, I think, and if I compare it to the game of the year from 2023, the one that actually won it was Baldur's Gate 3, and my game of the year was Lies of P, and I say both games are actually much better from Black Myth Wukong, but Black Myth Wukong is still a really good game that gave me a really good time. Overall, I really enjoyed Black Myth Wukong, and I do think it deserved to win a Game of the Year award. Again, it's not necessarily the game I would nominate for Game of the Year, probably either Elden Ring Shadow of the Year 3, although that's a DLC, so I guess if we count like original games, then I probably slightly enjoyed Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom slightly more, but then again, it's also part of a much bigger franchise, while Black Myth Wukong is an entirely new game from scratch, so I guess it did deserve to win Game of the Year award, because as I said, I really had a good time with the game, and I'm really glad it was one of the first games on the PS5 that I played. And now that I own a PS5, there are plenty of games that I'm really behind on, because there are plenty of PS5 games I really wanted to play, but wasn't really able to because didn't own a PS5, like Final Fantasy 16, for example, and some others. Will I review them all though? Maybe. It's gonna take me a lot of time to like play them all, but if I end up really loving any of them, then yes, I probably will review them, but I'm in no rush to be doing that for now, but here is my review of Black Myth Wukong, and thank you all of you for checking out this video game review. Press the like button, please subscribe to this channel, and I will talk to you soon in another video. Talk to you then, bye.